Welcome, everyone. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of railways, exploring their rich history, unique insignia, and the intricate management that keeps them running smoothly. Whether you're a seasoned traveler or just curious about the railways, there's something here for everyone. Let's start with a brief history. Railways have transformed the way we travel and transport goods, connecting communities and fostering economic growth. From the first steam locomotives to today's high-speed trains, each era has brought innovations that have shaped our world. Speaking of innovations, have you ever noticed the insignia on trains? These symbols tell stories of heritage and pride, representing the values and history of the railway companies. Each logo is a badge of honor, reflecting the dedication of those who work tirelessly behind the scenes. Now, let's talk about budget and management. Running a railway system is no small feat. It requires careful planning and resource allocation to ensure safety and efficiency. Effective management not only keeps trains on schedule, but also invests in infrastructure improvements, making travel smoother for everyone. Traveling on the railway is an adventure in itself. Imagine the scenic views as you glide along the tracks, connecting with nature and the landscapes of different regions. The routes and connections are thoughtfully designed to make your journey as seamless as possible, whether you're commuting to work or embarking on a cross-country trip. Of course, like any mode of transportation, railways have faced their share of challenges. Accidents and incidents, while rare, remind us of the importance of safety protocols and continuous improvement. The railway industry learns from these events, striving to enhance safety measures and ensure that every journey is a secure one. Lastly, let's touch on the coat of arms associated with many railway companies. These emblems often symbolize the values and traditions of the regions they serve, creating a sense of identity and belonging for passengers and employees alike. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the world of railways. I hope you found it as intriguing as I do. If you enjoyed this content, please consider following or subscribing for more insights and stories. Safe travels, and see you next time. ๊viːە Rail Canada Inc. Reporting Mark ๊viːە. ๊viːە, operating as ๊viːە Rail or ๊viːە Stylized as ๊viːە Rail, is a Canadian Crown corporation that operates intercity passenger rail service in Canada. As of December 2023, ๊viːە Rail operates 406 trains per week across 8 Canadian provinces and 12,500 kilometers, 7,800 miles of track, 97% of which is owned and maintained by other railway companies, mostly by Canadian National Railway (CN). ๊viːە Rail carried approximately 4.1 million passengers in 2023, 96% of which were along the corridor routes connecting the major cities of the Quebec City Windsor Corridor, and had an on-time performance of 85.4%. 1. Attracting international tourism forms an important part of ๊viːە Rail's long-distance trans-continental services. 3. For history backgrounds also, history of rail transport in Canada. CN are Rapido train cars in Pickering, July 1968. In an effort to attract riders, new train cars were acquired by CN in the 1960s. Yearly passenger levels on Canada's passenger trains peaked at 60 million during World War II. Following the war, the growth of air travel and the personal automobile caused significant loss of mode share for Canada's passenger train operators. By the 1960s, Canadian National Railway (CN) and the Canadian Pacific Railway (CP) found that passenger trains were no longer economically viable. CP sought to divest itself of its passenger trains, but federal government regulators and politicians balked, forcing them to maintain a minimal service through the 1970s, with the government subsidizing up to 80% of losses. CN, being a Crown corporation at that time, was encouraged by the federal government and political interests to invest in passenger trains. Innovative marketing schemes such as red, white, and blue fares, new equipment such as scenic dome cars and rail diesel cars, and services such as Rapido and the UAC Turbotrain trains temporarily increased numbers of passengers, reversing previous declines. 5. For 25, these increases proved temporary. By 1977, total passenger numbers had dropped below 5 million. The decline of passenger rail became a federal election issue in 1974 when the government of Pierre Trudeau promised to implement a nationwide carrier similar to Amtrak in the United States. Starting in 1976, CN began branding its passenger services with the bilingual name ๊viːə or ๊viːە CN. The ๊viːە logo began to appear on CN passenger locomotives and cars, while still carrying CN logos as well. That September, ๊viːە published a single timetable with information on both CN and CP trains, marking the first time that Canadians could find all major passenger trains in one publication. In 1977, CN underwent a dramatic restructuring when it placed various non-core freight railway activities into separate subsidiaries, such as ferries under CN Marine and passenger trains under ๊viːە Rail, which was subsequently renamed ๊viːە Rail Canada. 5. 6-9. Formation and early use of ๊viːە Rail train at Cochrane Station in August 1978. Earlier that year, CNR and CPR passenger rail service were spun off into ๊viːە Rail Canada. On January 12, 1977, CN spun off its passenger services as a separate Crown corporation, ๊viːە Rail Canada. At its inception, ๊viːە acquired all CN passenger cars and locomotives. Following several months of negotiation, on October 29, 1978, ๊viːە assumed all CP passenger train operations and took possession of cars and locomotives. Passenger train services, which were not included in the creation of ๊viːە Rail, included those offered by BC Rail, Algoma Central Railway, Ontario Northland Railway, Quebec North Shore, and Labrador Railway. Various urban commuter train services operated by CN and CP, and remaining CN passenger services in Newfoundland. At this time, ๊viːە did not own any trackage and had to pay right-of-way fees to CN and CP, sometimes being the only user of rural branch lines. Citation needed. ๊viːە initially had a tremendous variety of equipment, much of it in need of replacement, and operated routes stretching from Sydney, Nova Scotia, to Prince Rupert, British Columbia, and north to Churchill, Manitoba. Over 150 scheduled trains per week were in operation, including trans-continental services, regional trains, and corridor services. Citation needed. While ๊viːە remains an independent federal Crown corporation mandated to operate as a business, it is hindered by the fact that it was created by an order in council and not from legislation passed by PA. Reliament. Had ๊viːە been enabled by legislation, the company would be permitted to seek funding on the open money markets as other Crown corporations such as CN have done in the past. It is largely for this reason that critics say ๊viːە, like Amtrak in the United States, is vulnerable to federal budget cuts and continues to answer first to its political masters, as opposed to the business decisions needed to ensure the viability of intercity passenger rail service. 6-1980 Stel RC in Port Hope, October 1981. ๊viːە Rail ordered the LRCs in the 1980s to replace its older train cars. In 1981, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's government endorsed Minister of Transport Jean-Luc Pépin's plan, which slashed ๊viːə's budget, leading to a 40% reduction in the company's operations. Frequently sold-out trains, such as the Super-Continental and the popular Atlantic, were discontinued. The retrenchment of the former reduced ๊viːە to operating only one trans-continental train, the Canadian. Citation needed. ๊viːە also sought to reduce its reliance on over 30-year-old second-hand equipment and placed a significant order with Bombardier Transportation for new high-speed locomotives and cars which would be used in its corridor trains. The LRC light, rapid, comfortable locomotives and cars used advanced technology such as active tilt to increase speed, but proved troublesome and took several years to work out problems. By 1990, only a handful of LRC locomotives remained in service, which were subsequently retired by the arrival of the GE Genesis locomotives in 2001. Citation needed. The election of Brian Mulroney's progressive conservative government in 1980 brought an initial friend to ʻviːە, when several of Mulroney's commitments included rescinding the ʻviːە cuts of 1981 by restoring the supercontinental under pressure from his Western Caucasus, and the Atlantic under pressure from his Eastern Caucasus, and then St. John Mayor Elsie Wayne. Prime Minister Mulroney's government gave ʻviːە funding to refurbish some of its cars and purchase new locomotives, this time a more reliable model, from General Motors' diesel division. Citation needed. It was during this time, on February 8, 1986, that ʻviːә's eastbound supercontinental collided with a CN freight train near Hinton, Alberta, as a result of the freight train crew missing a signal light, resulting in 23 deaths. By the late 1980s, inflation and other rising costs were taking their toll on federal budgets, and in the Mulroney government's 1989 budget, ʻviːە again saw its budget slashed by $1 billion, 7 surpassing even the 1981 cuts under Trudeau. 1990 SA ʻviːە GMDFP7 leads the Canadian in Regina, May 1982. The Canadian was rerouted in the 1990s, ending service to several cities, like Calgary. Minister of Transport Benoit Bouchard oversaw the reduction in service on January 15, 1990, when ʻviːә's operations were reduced by 55%. Citation needed. The privatization of CN Rail in 1995 also negatively affected service, as it resulted in an effective monopoly, with ʻviːە trains having to yield to CN trains. 7 services, such as the supercontinental, were again discontinued, along with numerous disparate rural services, such as in Nova Scotia's Annapolis Valley and Cape Breton Island, Western Canada, and in the Corridor. The Canadian was also moved from its home rails on CP to the northerly CN route previously plied by the supercontinental. The shift to the less populated route between Toronto and Vancouver severed major western cities, such as Regina and Calgary, from the passenger rail network, and flared western bitterness toward the Government of Canada. Citation needed. The official justification for the rerouting was that the trains would serve more remote communities, but the concentration of ridings held by the progressive conservatives along the CN route attracted the charge that the move was chiefly political. Harvey Andre, one of Alberta's federal cabinet ministers who represented Calgary, stated publicly that he did not care if he never saw a passenger train again in his life. Citation needed. The Mulroney cuts allowed ʻviːە to consolidate its fleet of cars and locomotives, resulting in a fleet of refurbished stainless steel HEP1 and HEP2 rebuilds and LRC cars, as well as rationalizing its locomotive fleet with GM and Bombardier LRC units. Citation needed. ʻviːە was not spared from further cutbacks in Jean Chrétien's Liberal government elected in 1993. Minister of Finance Paul Martin's first budget in 1994 saw further ʻviːە cuts, which saw the popular Atlantic dropped from the schedule, focusing the Eastern trans-continental service on the ocean. CP had sold off a large portion of track the Atlantic had operated on, and, as ʻviːە at that time was only mandated to provide passenger services on tracks belonging to CN or CP, the route was discontinued. Citation needed. This move was seen as somewhat controversial and politically motivated, as the principal cities benefiting from the Atlantic service were Sherbrooke, Quebec, and St. John, New Brunswick, where the only 2 Progressive Conservative Party members of Parliament in Canada were elected in the 1993 federal election, in which Chrétien's Liberal Party took power. The ocean service, which was preserved, currently operates on track between Montreal and Halifax, running through the lower St. Lawrence River Valley and northern New Brunswick. The Minister of Transport in Chrétien's government at the time, Douglas Young, was elected from a district that included Bathurst, New Brunswick, on the ocean's route. A remote ʻviːە service to Quebec's Gaspé Peninsula, the Chaleur was also spared from being cut at this time, despite carrying fewer passengers than the Atlantic. Citation needed. Renaissance funding. A ʻviːە locomotive leads the International with Amtrak coaches. The International route was jointly operated by ʻviːە and Amtrak from 1982 to 2004. By the late 1990s, with a rail-friendly Minister of Transport, David Collinet, in office, there were modest funding increases to ๊viːە. Corridor services were improved with new and faster trains, a weekly tourist train, the Bras d'Or, returned ๊viːە service to Cape Breton Island for the first time since the 1990 cuts, and a commitment was made to continue operating on Vancouver Island. But Western Canada continued to languish, with the only service provided by the Canadian and a few remote service trains in northern BC and Manitoba. Citation needed. In a significant new funding program dubbed Renaissance, a fleet of unused passenger cars, which had been built for planned Nightstar sleeper services between locations in the United Kingdom and continental Europe via the Channel Tunnel, were purchased and adapted following the cancellation of the Nightstar project. The new Renaissance cars were swiftly nicknamed Déplaisants, displeasure by French-speaking employees and customers due to early problems adapting the equipment for Canadian use. Doors and toilets froze in cold Atlantic Canada temperatures, resulting in delays and service interruptions. New diesel-electric P4-2 DC locomotives purchased from General Electric GE allowed the withdrawal of older locomotives, including remaining LRCs. LRC passenger cars were retained and continued to provide much of the corridor service. This expansion to ๊viːә's fleet has permitted scheduling flexibility. Additionally, many passenger stations have been remodeled into passenger-friendly destinations, with several hosting co-located transit and regional bus hubs for various municipalities. Citation needed. 2000 ๊viːە Rail P4-2 DC pulling LRC coaches towards Montreal in October 24, 2003. Federal Minister of Transport David Collinet announced $700 million in new funding over the next 5 years. This funding was below the $3 billion needed to implement a high-speed rail proposal in the Quebec City Windsor Corridor nicknamed ๊viːəfast. However, the funding was intended to provide for faster, more frequent, and more reliable passenger service across Canada, preserving the option for higher speed rail, such as the ๊viːəfast proposal, said Collinet. This new project was to be called Renaissance 2. On December 18, 2003, Liberal Prime Minister PM Paul Martin froze federal spending on all major capital projects, including ๊viːә's 5-year $700 million Renaissance 2 program announced just 6 weeks earlier by outgoing PM Chrétien's administration. Critics of Martin's cuts claimed that he was in a conflict of interest as his family, through Canada Steamship Lines and various subsidiary and affiliated companies, had once had a significant investment in the Voyager Colonial Bus Lines, an intercity bus line in Quebec and Eastern Ontario that was a key competitor of ๊viːە. Citation needed. Routes cut under the Martin government included the seasonal Bras d'Or tourist train, which ran for the last time in September 2004, and the Montreal-Toronto overnight enterprise, which was discontinued in September 2005. The Sarnia-Chicago International was also discontinued in April 2000 by Amtrak. ๊viːә's portion of the route from Toronto-Sarnia remained in operation as ๊viːە was able to use their own equipment to operate the train. Citation needed. Sponsorship scandal. See also Sponsorship Scandal. Federal Auditor General's report released on February 10, 2004 showed what appeared to be a criminal misdirection of government funds intended for advertising to key Quebec-based supporters of the Liberal Party of Canada. Included in the Auditor General's report was the fact that ๊viːە was used as one of several federal government departments, agencies, and crown corporations to funnel these illicit funds. Forced to act on the Auditor General's report due to its political implications, Martin's government suspended ๊viːە President Marc Lefrançois on February 24, 2004, giving him an ultimatum of several days to defend himself against allegations in the report or face further disciplinary action. Citation needed. Several days later, during Lefrançois' suspension, former ๊viːە Marketing Department employee Miriam Bedard claimed she had been fired several years earlier when she questioned company billing practices in dealing with advertising companies. According to CBC News, An arbitrator's report later concluded that Bedard had voluntarily left ʻviːə. She was publicly belittled by ʻviːə CEO Jean Pelletier in national media on February 27, 2004. Pelletier retracted his statements, but on March 1, Pelletier was fired. By March 5, after failing to defend himself adequately against the allegations in the Auditor General's report, Lefrançois was fired as well. Citation needed increasing problems and reinstated funding via RDCs. At Qualicum Beach Station, a stop on Victoria Courtenay train. The Victoria Courtenay service was suspended in March 2010. The reversal of funding in 2003 led to a backlog of deferred maintenance and left ʻviːə unable to replace or refurbish life-expired locomotives and rolling stock. Conversely, ʻviːə ridership increased from 3.8 million in 2005 to 4.1 million in 2006. 10. On October 11, 2007, Finance Minister Jim Flaherty announced federal government funding of $691.9 million over 5 years, of which $519 million was for capital projects and the remainder additional operating funding. The capital funding was earmarked to refurbish ʻviːə's fleet of 54 ๊viːə locomotives to meet new emission standards and extend their service lives by 15 to 20 years, refurbish the interiors of LRC coaches, reduce track capacity bottlenecks and speed restrictions in the Windsor Quebec City corridor, and make repairs to a number of stations across the network. 11. This announcement was similar in content to the previous Renaissance to package, and once again was criticized for not including new equipment or funding for services outside the Windsor Quebec City corridor. Shortly afterwards, documents obtained by the Canadian press under the Access to Information Act revealed that delays due to equipment failures had risen by 60% since the previous year. The company attributed this to problems with the aging ๊viːə locomotive fleet. 12. On January 27, 2009, the Government of Canada's 2009 Economic Action Plan increased funding to ʻviːə by $407 million to support improvements, including increased train frequencies and enhanced on-time performance and speed, particularly in the Montreal-Ottawa-Toronto corridor. 13. On July 21, 2009, ʻviːə began canceling all trains in anticipation of an engineers' strike, which officially began at midnight. Engineers had been without a contract since December 31, 2006. Needs update. Full service resumed on July 27. 14. An additional strike by the Canadian Auto Workers (CAW) Union, representing around 2,200 employees, was planned to begin on July 4, 2010, but was called off after the union and ʻviːə reached a 3-year contract. 15. 2010s. A ʻviːə F for OPH-D in Jasper, February 2011. ʻviːə's fleet of F for OPH-Ds were refurbished in the late 2000s to meet emission standards. ʻviːə experienced more service cuts at the dawn of the 2010s. In March 2011, the daily Victoria Courtenay, the Malahat RDC service on Vancouver Island, was suspended indefinitely due to deteriorating track it has yet to resume. By June 27, 2012, ʻviːə announced additional service cuts due to funding issues. The Canadian was reduced from 3 days a week to 2 days a week beginning November 2012. Service operated twice weekly November-April and thrice weekly May-October until 2019. In 2019, only 2 trains per week operated on the full route, while the third train ran only between Vancouver and Edmonton once a week in each direction. The Ocean was reduced from 6 days a week to thrice weekly beginning October 2012. Corridor services west of Toronto were reduced, with weekend service reductions to Montreal and Ottawa, Ontario. 16 corridor services to Sarnia and the Niagara region were reduced to once daily in October 2012, with additional taking effect in Sarnia was left with a single daily round trip. 17 Niagara Falls lost all service except the joint Amtrak ʻviːə daily New York City-Toronto Maple Leaf service. 18 Although Toronto regional commuter service was later provided by GO Transit. Corridor services to Kitchener. 19 London, 20 and Windsor 21 were reduced starting in October 2012, with at least 2 daily round trips surviving. In September 2013, the Gaspé service, which had been bustituted in 2011, was suspended indefinitely. 22. To address declining on-time performance due to freight train traffic on ~viະroutes. MP Olivia Chow drafted a private member's bill in 2014 that would reorganize the company and allow the government to force freight rail carriers to give scheduling priority to public passenger rail. However, as with most private members' bills, it was not passed. 23-24. Service improvements. Quebec Windsor Corridor was the focus of service restorations and implements. A direct Ottawa-Quebec City train was restored, with additional trips between Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto being added. In 2016, LRC passenger cars used for the corridor were refurbished in the ~viៈ 1 class. This included single seating. A passenger car adorned in Canada 150 livery. August 2017. For the country's sesquicentennial, ~viៈreleased a special youth rail pass. In March 2017, ~viៈannounced the release of a new category of rail pass valid for the month of July 2017, corresponding to Canada's sesquicentennial celebrations for youth aged 18 to 25, costing $150, several $100s cheaper than a comparable rail pass would typically cost. A larger-than-expected response resulted in the temporary loss of functionality for ~viៈwebsite. Despite plans to cap the number of passes sold at 1867, the year of Canadian Confederation, over 4,000 passes were ultimately sold. The company received significant backlash, as it initially appeared there was no limit on the number of passes available. 25. Extreme winter conditions had always been an operational hazard for ~viៈ, with the Ottawa routes and Canadian being most vulnerable. 26. Equally, summer repairs and construction often delayed trains system-wide, even though schedules were regularly adjusted in an attempt to minimize delays. 26. However, by 2018, freight traffic on the heavily used CN lines had become a significant concern for maintaining on-time service. 27-28. This issue rose due to typical siding sizes, which were not long enough to accommodate modern freight trains. Passenger trains were consequently placed on sidings whenever the trains passed rather than freights, which meant that passenger trains did not have priority on CN lines. 29-30. The issue existed in all parts of the ~viៈnetwork, although it became most extreme on the Canadian, where delays increased from an average of 5 hours to as much as 50 over the 4-day journey. 31-30-29. ~viៈultimately addressed the issue by eliminating its late policy on its cross-Canada trains, but retaining it for the corridor routes. 30-28. However, ~viៈcontinues to compensate inconvenienced guests with necessary hotel accommodations prior to the journey, as well as ensuring continued transportation where a connection to a second ~viៈtrain had been missed. 28. As such, compensation costs were factored into ~viៈ 2018 budget. By the end of 2018, the full route time on the Canadian had been increased twice to absorb freight delays. 27-33-28. The second extension to 5 days has been mostly successful in decreasing delays and also allowed for a daytime transit of Hell's Gate in BC, previously transversed overnight in the dark. The scheduled increased running time actually resulted in the Canadian arriving early on several occasions. 30-35. However, Toronto-Vancouver service frequencies were reduced to only twice weekly during peak summer period, with a third Toronto-Edmonton run suspended entirely. Clear on December 12, 2018, ~viៈannounced that it had awarded a contract to Siemens Canada for 32 train sets to replace the entire Quebec City Windsor Corridor fleet. 36. This marked the completion of a procurement process launch following the 2018 federal budget, which allocated funding for the fleet replacement. During the request for proposal stage, ~viៈhad narrowed the potential suppliers down to Siemens, Bombardier, Talgo, and Stadler Rail. Siemens was ultimately selected after finishing first on the key criteria, which included the ability to deliver in a timely fashion, the quality of the product offering, and the price. The new fleet will consist of Siemens SC for 2 locomotives hauling a combination of coaches, business-class cars, and cab cars from the Siemens Venture series to allow bidirectional operation. The trains will be built at Siemens plant in Sacramento, California, and Siemens committed to including at least 20% Canadian content in the final product. The order includes an option for an additional 16 train sets to be exercised if the federal government approves ʻviːə's high-frequency dedicated corridor project. 37. The first train set is to be delivered for testing by winter 2021, with the first sets in service by 2022 and all trains in service by 2024. The delivery of the new trains will allow ʻviːə to retire LRC and Renaissance equipment from the corridor and reallocate the HEP2 and corridor-based HEP1 cars to other parts of the network. 2.0 to OSA ʻviːə Rail SCV40 to charger pushing Siemens Venture train sets in 2023 on October 30, 2021. ʻviːə Rail implemented a mandatory COVID-19 vaccine policy in line with new Transport Canada regulations in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which required all ʻviːə Rail staff and passengers aged 12 and older to be fully vaccinated against COVID-19 to travel aboard ʻviːə Rail trains. Insignia. In addition to using commercial logos, ʻviːə Rail is one of several Crown corporations that has been granted heraldic symbols by the Canadian Heraldic Authority. The coat of arms was granted on May 15, 2020, and presented by Canada's Chief Herald. 42 an heraldic badge was approved for use at the same time as the coat of arms. The badge design follows the design of a law enforcement agency badge in Canada, denoting the responsibilities of ʻviːə Rail Police Service. The Royal Crown indicates that ʻviːə Rail has police constables appointed for the enforcement of the laws relating to the protection of persons and property. 42 a flag was also granted by the Canadian Heraldic Authority. It is black and charged with ʻviːə Rail's badge. 40 to budget and management. ʻviːə is operated as an independent Crown corporation and receives a subsidy from the Minister of Transport to provide service to remote communities. ʻviːə operates more than 500 trains per week from coast to coast. The sum of 369 million Canadian dollars was earned from passenger revenues in 2018. Over 4.7 million passenger voyages were taken in 2018. An on-time ratio of 71% was achieved in that year. Over 3,115 persons were employed by ʻviːə by the end of 2018. ʻviːə President Yves Desjardins Siciliano stated that the subsidy for passenger rail travel in Canada in 2015 was about 200%. For every $1 travelers spend on fares, Canada pays $2 in subsidy. 43 as of May 2019, the chair of the board of directors, the annual accounts of ʻviːə are audited to GAAP principles by the Auditor General of Canada under the Financial Administration Act. As a federal Crown corporation, ʻviːə Rail Canada Inc. operates under the Canada Business Corporations Act and is subject to income taxes should a profit ever be declared by it. The corporation had $9,300,000 in share capital as of 2018. ʻviːə also received $394 million of government funding in 2018. Citation needed, Expansion Plans Maritimes. ʻviːə has explored the introduction of daily regional service in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick-Connacht, Ting Halifax, Moncton, and Campbellton to complement the thrice-weekly ocean service to Montreal. As of 2017, ʻviːə's statement was that it was exploring an eastern intercity corridor service and that further developments were dependent on infrastructure upgrades and equipment testing. 40 for ʻviːə has also expressed interest in operating commuter rail service on CN tracks in Halifax that would run from the city's downtown station as far as Windsor Junction. 40 for 45. However, in June 2019, Halifax Regional Council voted unanimously to direct staff not to pursue commuter rail service further. due to infrastructure requirements and associated financial implications, as well as operational considerations and restraints. 4647 High-Frequency Rail Project ʻviːə developed a $4.4 billion high-frequency rail HFR service plan as a response to delays faced by sharing tracks with freight trains. The plan opts for a dedicated track between Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and Quebec City, offering more frequent trains, although running at conventional speeds. In Ontario, ʻviːə would run a new rail line on currently underused tracks from Toronto to Ottawa through Peterborough instead of Kingston. In Quebec, corridor trains would travel from Montreal to Quebec City through Trois-Rivières on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River rather than on the south shore through Drummondville. 24. ʻviːə claimed this would allow them to run more trains in the corridor, reduce trip times by 25%, and improve on-time performance to over 95%. 48 feasibility studies were funded by the federal government in the 2016-2018 budgets, and the 2018 budget allowed for the funding of the fleet replacement portion of the plan, though not the dedicated rail lines. 49. Contrary to expectations, the 2019 federal budget did not include a final decision for new funds for HFR. 50. However, in January, ʻviːə announced the hiring of a joint venture of engineering firms AECOM and RUP to undertake a detailed engineering study of the proposal. 51. The Toronto City Council passed a motion supporting the project on March 30, 2023. 52. In February 2025, the federal government announced that the ʻviːə HFR project had now become ALTO, a high-speed rail network in the Toronto, Quebec City corridor. 53. To former ʻviːə routes, the Malahat service ended in 2011 and Chaleur service ended in 2013, are currently suspended due to poor track conditions. ʻviːə plans to reintroduce service once track upgrades have been completed. 44. The Quebec government announced funds for repairs to Chaleur trackage in 2017, with a completion date stated only as being several years away. 54. No concrete plan to restore trackage along the Malahat has been announced as of 2020. A ʻviːə for OPH to D leading the Winnipeg-Churchill train, November 2012. The service was suspended from May 2017 to December 2018 for track maintenance. The Winnipeg-Churchill train was disrupted by severe spring flooding on May 23, 2017, when the Hudson Bay Railway tracks were damaged beyond standard maintenance. Winnipeg-Gillam service continued. 55. Omnitracks, the original owner of the track, refused to make the repairs, saying that the track was no longer viable, despite the matching federal subsidy. 56. The railroad was Churchill's only land link to southern Canada, and its loss resulted in significant cost of living increases for residents along the corridor. A stranded train was removed by ship in October 2017. 56. Service to Churchill was restored in late 2018 after the tracks, Churchill Port, and Churchill Marine Tank Farm were purchased by Arctic Gateway Group. 50. The federal government assisted in the purchase with $74 million of dedicated northern infrastructure money up front and an additional commitment of $43 million over 10 years. 59-57. To restore passenger rail service before winter, Arctic Gateway repaired 29 washouts in 35 days. Although a special ʻviːə train arrived in Churchill on November 1st, the first regular ʻviːə train arrived in Churchill on December 4th, 560 days after service initially ceased. 60-61. On February 13, 2020, following several days of blockades during the nationwide Coastal GasLink pipeline protests, ʻviːə Rail announced that it would be shutting down most of its passenger train service across Canada until further notice, with the exception of the Sudbury-White River train line and the Winnipeg-Churchill train between Churchill and the Pas. 60-63-64. Later in 2020, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, nearly all ʻviːə Rail trains were suspended, with the exception of the Winnipeg-Churchill train, as well as one train daily on each route within the core. Ridord 65-66. along with the previous protest-related service suspensions. It is the most extensive temporary reduction of service in Via Rail's history. Travel on Via varies by region as much as class. Many of Via's policies and protocols are the product of running a national train system with varying pressures and needs of different passengers, communities, and contexts. The results are wide-ranging travel experiences depending on the distance and location of the journey. Some Via routes outside the corridor offer the option of unscheduled stops at places where there is no station. With 48 hours notice, a passenger can request to entrain or to train at a specified milepost. This option is available on all of the adventure routes, as well as the Canadian between Capril and Winnipeg. 67. Smoking is prohibited on all Via trains. Smoking tobacco has been banned on the corridor routes since 1993-74, and this policy was gradually extended to all trains. While smoking cannabis was banned on all Via routes on the same day it was made legal in Canada, the last remaining on-board smoking was permitted in a smoker's lounge on some long-distance routes, only at certain times of day until 2002. 75 washrooms are provided for each car. On sleeper cars, every private room has its own separate washroom. Food service varies by train. All trains besides the Sudbury White River train offer snacks, light meals, and both alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages for purchase. Long-distance trains offer traditional sit-down dining and full meals to sleeper class passengers. Economy class passengers can purchase hot takeout meals prepared in the dining car on long-distance trains during the peak season and eat in the sit-down dining car in the off-peak. 76. Complimentary Wi-Fi service is available in the corridor. 77, 78, 79. Via was the first North American transportation service to offer Wi-Fi to its passengers in early 2006 and was one of the first in the world to do so. Wi-Fi service has been added to the ocean train in the service cars, 80, although connections are unreliable in most places outside urban centers. Via operates in the provinces of Alberta, British Columbia, Manitoba, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Ontario, Quebec, and Saskatchewan. The only province or territory connected to the Continental Railway network and not served by Via is the Northwest Territories. Newfoundland and Labrador, Nunavut, Prince Edward Island, and Yukon have no rail connections to the Continental network and thus no Via service. The Maple Leaf, operating between New York City and Toronto via Albany, Buffalo, and Niagara Falls, is jointly managed by Via and Amtrak. The train operates using Amtrak equipment, but on the Canadian side of the border is staffed by Via employees and operated as a typical Via train. Two other train routes link Canada and the U.S., the Adirondack Montreal New York and the Amtrak Cascades Vancouver Seattle Portland. Stations with Via at their Canadian termini. They are fully operated by Amtrak and single-ticket connections to Via trains are not offered. Via also has connection agreements with several local and intercity bus operators, car-sharing services, and airlines. Passengers who are flying with some airlines can combine their air and rail trips under the same record locator. 85 Via operates in the provinces of Alberta, British Columbia, Manitoba, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Ontario, Quebec, and Saskatchewan. The only province or territory connected to the Continental Railway network and not served by Via is the Northwest Territories. Newfoundland and Labrador, Nunavut, Prince Edward Island, and Yukon have no rail connections to the Continental network and thus no Via service. Via operates over 475 trains per week over 19 routes, marketed in for broad categories, 80 to Ontario and Quebec. Corridor service, comprising frequent regional and local trains between major cities in a band from southwestern Ontario to Quebec City. The vast majority of Via's trains, over 400 per week, operate here. Cities served by corridor trains include Windsor, Sarnia, London, Toronto, Kingston, Ottawa, Montreal, and Quebec City. In 2017, corridor service accounted for 95% of ʻviːə's ridership and 77% of its revenue. 83. The Maritime Way. Ocean, providing long-distance service between Quebec and the Maritime Province. In 2017, the ocean accounted for 2% of ʻviːə's ridership and 3% of its revenue. 83. The Great Western Way. Canadian, providing both long-distance service between Southern Ontario and Western Canada, as well as essential rail services through Northern Ontario. In 2017, the Canadian accounted for 2% of ʻviːə's ridership and 20% of its revenue. 83. Adventure Routes. 5 regional and long-distance routes that offer essential rail transportation in rural northern areas. In 2017, these routes in aggregate accounted for 1% of ʻviːə's ridership and revenue.